Okay, so for the second presentation for Chapter 6, having introduced the concept of deviance and social control sanctions in Part 1, we are going to be turning to answering the question, why does deviance occur? Because although as established in the first presentation, that some deviance is both normal and essentially a good thing for society, according to functionalists, it is still not necessarily the norm, right? We don't expect people to be deviant. Most people to be deviant most of the time. So when people are deviant, then the big question is why. So, for this question, we are going to be answering this by considering several different approaches and theories based on the primary theoretical perspectives, as well as based on some perspectives that we don't necessarily always consider in this course, like the sociobiological perspective. So, jumping into this question, why does deviance occur? Let's just first of all acknowledge the fact that it's not like we have like some established right or wrong answer. Going back to that chapter on theory, it kind of depends on which set of glasses that you put on, and in terms of which explanation maybe makes the most sense to you, or that you feel is the best explanation for explaining deviance. The three that your book, the three types of perspectives that your book highlights are biosocial, psychological, and sociological. And of those three, this presentation is going to address two of those, biosocial and sociological. So let me just briefly state that that's not because I don't feel as if the psychological explanations of deviance have no merit. They have a lot of merit, and actually, I would say in society, they carry more weight than the sociological perspectives on deviance, because a lot of the psychological explanations relate to particular personality disorders that might cause deviance. So, if you've ever read anything about sociopaths or psychopaths or narcissistic personality disorder, right, then all of those were psychological explanations. And for those of you who maybe have taken a psych class, you probably know a lot more about that material than I do. For this particular class, because it's sociology, we're obviously going to focus on the sociological ones, but then because biosocial explanations, the social part of that, does relate to sociology, that's the reason why I am going to also offer a little bit of explanation of those explanations as well. Oh, that was a tongue twister. So we're actually going to begin with that biosocial perspective. So, just a reminder about what biosocial or sociobiology is. This is a kind of modern approach that tries to successfully blend both nature and nurture explanations of people's behavior. So, in that sense, they try to offer a explanation that highlights the role of genetic predispositions, inherited characteristics and traits, but it also highlights the fact that these genetic predispositions, inherited traits, are formed and take place in a larger kind of social context. And so, therefore, they also feel like environmental factors also should have equal weight here. And so, sociobiology, while certainly not a prominent perspective in the field, does have its proponents, and people who utilize this type of perspective. In terms of methodology, you sometimes see that they rely on both parent child studies, where they try to establish links between parent and child behaviors like alcoholism, mental illness, criminal convictions, that highlights both the role of environment and socialization as well as inherited traits and characteristics. But even maybe more popular than parent-child studies is twin studies, especially if it's twins that were adopted into certain separate families and raised apart, because those types of twins allow us to really try to determine, what has more weight here. Is it inherited characteristics, which for identical twins, they pretty much would perfectly share, or is it environmental factors, socialization, which if they are raised in different settings, would allow us to kind of determine, okay, in this particular sense, it seems like socialization is more important. So that's the methods that in general, like or, the methodological techniques when they set up studies that sociobiologists really use in order to make these determinations. Specifically in regards to deviance, I'm going to highlight kind of two concepts from this perspective. First of all, there's this idea of what we call gene-environment interactions. And this is basically the idea that you do have these inherited characteristics, these genes. And the example I give here is what sometimes is commonly referred to as the sociopath gene, although people acknowledge that it seems more like a gene cluster where, you have a lack of inhibitions and, kind of a low or kind of lacking conscience, as well as some aggressive tendencies. So you have these inherited traits that you got from your family, but a gene environment interaction suggests that these genes can lie dormant, right, they don't necessarily have to control or regulate your behavior given the type of environment that you grew up in. So if you have someone with this particular gene or gene cluster, and they grew up in, a supportive household, with very patient parents who, taught them how to self-regulate their behavior, did a good job of explaining, the importance of empathy, that even though this particular individual might naturally still have these tendencies, they may be way less likely to act on them because they are not in the type of environment that would encourage such action, versus someone that maybe grew up in a household that was volatile, where the parents themselves are hostile and non-supportive, and perhaps are violent. In that type of environment, maybe the gene has a much higher likelihood of being expressed. So for people who study this, which admittedly, this is not my wheelhouse. This is not the type of sociology that I have a lot of experience in. But gene environment interactions would offer a potential sociobiological explanation as to why some people are more likely to engage in deviant behavior. Not just because they have genes that contribute to deviance, but then they grew up in an environment that also made it more likely that these genes would be expressed. Another sociobiological perspective is what we call the hormonal feedback loop. So here, instead of focusing on genes, we're focusing explicitly on hormones. And this hormonal feedback loop has been particularly popular in explaining kind of testosterone. So if you think about testosterone and what we associate with testosterone, men have it in greater quantities, so we associate it with men. We associate it sometimes with aggressive, violent behavior. People that study, and people's testosterone levels, including men, it ranges. Like someone can have a high testosterone count, someone can have a low testosterone count. But the hormonal feedback loop suggests that you can also manipulate the amount of testosterone in your system by engaging in activities that cause your testosterone to spike. And so what you see here is testosterone. A person with a higher level of testosterone might be more likely to be aggressive or engage in aggressive activities, and then be successful in those aggressive activities. So whether or not you're thinking about you pick fights at a bar and you win those fights, or maybe you're really aggressive on the football field, or on the in the hockey rink, or on the basketball court, and you're successful in those contexts because of that aggression. Well, the hormonal feedback loop suggests that then, because of that success, this would contribute to an even higher level of testosterone, which then would make you even more likely to engage in this type of behavior again. And so, this has some really interesting implications, not just in the world of deviance, like, why might someone engage in violent behavior, multiple incidents of violence, escalating amounts of violence, but people also are very interested in this kind of hormonal feedback loop in regards to testosterone when you think about people engaging in, violent sports. And if you've ever read any editorials, commentary about, people, why do some people struggle with keeping the violence of their sport, in the context of just the sport? Why does it spill over into things like sexual abuse or domestic violence, or getting in fights, whether on the field, off the field? The hormonal feedback loop explanation, I certainly think, raises some interesting questions, right? About how engaging in this behavior further increases testosterone, which causes you to further engage this behavior, which causes you to further have increased testosterone, and raise questions about, where does this stop? So those are just some sociobiological perspectives. Obviously, we're going to focus a lot more on sociological perspectives, and particularly we're going to focus on sociological perspectives that come from the functionalist perspective and the symbolic interactionist perspective. We're going to save our discussion of social conflict perspectives when we get to the criminal justice system. So, explaining deviance from the functional perspective. So, the first name, which should be a familiar name at this point, is Emil Durkheim. He's our go-to classical functionalist theorist. And so, as I said in the first presentation, Durkheim said that deviance contributes to social solidarity by enhancing the sense of what is right and what is wrong, right? By kind of looking at what other people are doing wrong. For the rest of us, it gives us kind of some moral clarity and boundaries. Like, okay, all of us are in the right because that person over there is clearly doing the wrong thing, and we're all gonna kind of get together and, sanction that person and judge them. Now, he says, and for that reason, he was like, that is why a little bit of deviance in society isn't a bad thing. But the problem becomes is when too many people in society are engaging in deviance, because it can potentially contribute to something called anomie. And this was a Durkheim concept where he argues that basically, because of the amount of deviance in society, that it creates a state of confusion, because people now have lost sight of the shared rules and values that give order and meaning to their lives. So it's now no longer clear what is deviant and what is normative. And so the examples that I usually give is, come out of like the civil rights movement. The South had, during the Jim Crow period of de jure segregation, had largely looked at African Americans and treated African Americans a certain way. During the civil rights movement, as both African Americans pushed back against that treatment, as well as people from outside of the South kind of came into the South to participate in Freedom Summer and marches and protests. If you were a white Southerner during this time period, this probably felt very much like anomie. Everything that you were raised to believe that was correct and right was getting questioned and was getting sanctioned by people outside of that society. And there was not this clear sense of what is the expected thing for me to do. Do I do what has been expected of me within my kind of Southern society? Or now that America largely is kind of negatively sanctioning what we are doing here, do I go along with that? So, that is what's meant by anomie, when a whole kind of society gets shaken up and it's not necessarily clear about what's normative and what's deviant. Now, because I don't watch these movies, I'm just kind of taking a student's word for it. But I did have a student give the example of the Purge movies, especially I guess there was one movie that talked about the first Purge, right? How do you establish something like that? This idea that anything goes on the night of the Purge, right? That all this behavior that it would be considered deviant, criminal, is now for this one night normative. Like that kind of general sense, especially I guess on that first Purge night. Or that first purge of not anomie, not knowing what is expected, not knowing quite what to do. How do you fit in a setting or a context like that? So Emil Durkheim's concept of anomie was further expanded upon by a much later structural functionalist theorist named Robert Merton. And so he was interested in how people kind of have a common understanding of society's goals and a common understanding of the appropriate way to reach these goals, but how if they are unable to reach these goals through the legitimate ways that society has set up, how this might lead to a sense of anomie, of feeling like, okay, this society, its goals, its ways of achieving those goals, it doesn't feel right to me. I don't feel like I belong. And so he calls these the modes of adaptation, of which one of them, conformity, is the easiest. It means that you accept society's goals, and society's goals in this case, think about what it is that we tell people they should want out of life, right? This kind of stereotypical middle class lifestyle where you own a home and you have a family, you take an occasional vacation, you go to work every day, but then you spend time with your kids, maybe participate in a bowling league or something like that on the weekend. But like, this is what we hold up as like what is a good life in American society. And then when we think about how we tell people you achieve that good life, what is it that we mainly say? We say it's through work. And now we increasingly say, in order to get the type of job to get you that type of life, for most people, we encourage them to go to college, right? Earn a degree, get this type of job so you can have this middle class lifestyle. And so if you accept the goal, like, yes, I want to live that life, and then you accept the way in which society is telling you you should go about achieving that goal by going to school, getting a job, working your way up through the job, then you are exhibiting, according to Merton, conformity. You accept the goal, you accept the means. But the other four possible paths he calls deviant paths, and they involve some level of acceptance and or rejection of either the means, the goal, or both. And so I'm going to talk through this because there'll be several questions about this on the test. So first of all, the first path is innovation. And so I don't want you to think about innovation the way that we use it in our maybe everyday lives, where we're talking about being, an inventor, an invention, right? Creating something unique. This isn't what he meant by innovation. By Burton's definition, an innovator is a person that accepts the goal, like, yes, I want this type of lifestyle, but they reject the institutionalized means, meaning that they are probably going about getting the goal in a way that society wouldn't find acceptable. So think about the ways in which you can make money in the society that maybe we wouldn't find acceptable. The things that, your mom or dad, wouldn't be proud of. This would mean everything from like actual like criminal behavior. So maybe you sell drugs, maybe you engage in internet and credit card fraud, or maybe it would be things that, while are not necessarily illegal, are largely socially frowned upon. So maybe you engage in sex work. Maybe you're an exotic dancer. These are the types of things that do not necessarily reflect the institutionalized means of trying to achieve this goal of financial success. And so Merton would call that path innovation. Ritualism means that you could care less about the goal. Like, it really doesn't matter to you being financially successful. Like, that is not what inspires you at all. But for whatever reason, you largely go along with the institutionalized means, meaning you go to school, you get a job, but not because you're motivated by any particular goal, but largely just because you want to fit in. That's what everyone else is doing around you. So you don't really question it. You're like, what else would I do with my life, with my time, if I wasn't going to college, getting a degree, then getting some job I don't care about, but I could care less about being successful, owning a home, the materialism, the capitalism that we kind of hold up as a success in society. So we call those people ritualists. You're just going through the motions, just going through the ritual. The third deviant path is retreatism. In this case, you're rejecting both the goal and the means. So you could care less about being successful, but you also could care less about going to school and getting a job and going to work. So, if you're a retreatist, maybe you're living off the grid, living off the land somewhere. Or a much more likely case, you're living in your parents', basement or garage, and you are not working, and largely just mooching off of them. And you don't really have a plan beyond that. We would call those people retreatists. You have retreated from what society expects of you, both in terms of what society expects you to value and how society expects you to behave in terms of going about achieving those values. And then the final deviant path is rebellion. And if you're a rebel, like the retreatists, you are rejecting the cultural goals and the institutionalized means, but then you are replacing them with something else. So you all are really young and maybe don't really remember like Occupy Wall Street. Um, but then this also goes back to like, any really type of protesters that are wanting to overhaul society. You want to change society's values and you want to change the kind of how people go about achieving those values. So if instead of financial success, you think that the value should be, personal happiness and, people should work just enough in order to achieve that, then you might be a rebel, right? Because you're not just rejecting the goals and means of society, but you're offering up some type of replacement. And we call this strain theory, right? Because it's the idea that all these deviant paths are in some way feeling a sense of strain, because they are unable to or unwilling to share the common values and institutionalized means of society, and that's now contributed to them having this sense of anomie. And so the final of the functionalist perspectives, and I'm sorry there, I bumbled a little bit with the slide order, is called containment theory. And so with containment theory, we're kind of shifting to how people around you, about how your place in society, your support system in society can potentially prevent you, contain you, from participating in deviance. So here the focus is a lot on social bonds. And the language here, so there are pushes and pulls that influence your likelihood of committing a crime or being deviant. The pulls are outside of you. Environmental factors like poverty, living in a bad neighborhood, having, friends who engage in deviant behavior. So pulls are outside of you. They're pulling you to be deviant. Pushes are the internal kind of traits and characteristics within you that might be contributing to you being deviant. So you might have an aggressive personality. You might have a, lack of a moral core. You lack a conscience. You might have an impulsive nature. All of these would be pushes. These are things that are pushing you to be deviant or criminal. And people all have a unique combination of their own pushes and pulls. But people also, especially people who don't turn to crime, don't engage in deviant behavior, it's because they have containments in their life. And once again, they can be inner or outer. Your outer containments are things like a supportive family, a role model, a teacher you look up to. So these are people outside of you who are maybe encouraging you in some way to not be a deviant to not engage in criminal behavior. So they are outer containment. But then you might also have things inside of you, and we call those inner containments. And so these would be things like maybe you have a strong sense of right and wrong. Maybe you just have a lot of self-control. Maybe, you're just like a really like paranoid person that's just sure that you would get caught if you did something deviant. All of these would be inner containments. And so what we often say is that a person that has low pushes and pulls in their life, regardless of their containments, maybe it's just going to be less likely to be deviant because there just isn't a lot pushing or pulling them towards being a deviant. But a person that does have pulls and pushes, things that are influencing them to potentially be deviant, this is where containments become really important. Inner containments, which, like everything that's kind of genetic, you don't necessarily have a lot of control over. But from a sociological standpoint, we're really interested in outer containments. And people that are big proponents of containment theory usually support things like mentoring programs, providing students, access to role models and internships when they're in schools, because we believe that outer containments might make all the difference here. So that's it for the functionalist theories. Now we're going to have a couple of interactionist theories. And so the first interactionist theory is differential association. And it sounds really fancy. Deviant and criminal behavior results from associating with people with attitudes favorable to deviant or criminal behavior. But my grandmother has a saying, if you lie down with dogs, you wake up with fleas. And that's basically what's going on here. If you engage and spend time with people who participate in deviant and criminal acts, then this is going to influence you to potentially engage in deviant and criminal acts because those acts are going to start to look more normative to you than they would to people who didn't have such people in their lives. And of course, part of this is based on, what your frequency, intensity, length, and chronology of relationships, what that looks like with these people that are engaging in these deviant criminal acts. If it's people that you spend a lot of time with, or people that you, have known for a very long time, or people that you care a lot about, so, your close friends, your family, a significant other, then these people really can sway kind of your perspective on what is deviant and what is not, and contribute to the likelihood that you will engage in deviant behavior. And then the final kind of theory, and this relates back to concepts that we talked about in the first video, is labeling theory. And this is just studying how labels become attached to people based on certain types of behavior. And it really just emphasizes the fact that deviance is socially constructed. Primary deviance is objective. People engage in deviant behavior. But that next level of deviance, where someone is labeled a deviant by others, that becomes a lot more subjective. And people that study labeling theory are very interested in, who does this happen to? Why are some people more likely to be labeled than others? Why do some people, once labeled, get stuck with the label and find it a lot harder to get rid of that label? And people that study labeling theory are also very interested in the consequences of being labeled. Once you're labeled, how does this influence your future behavior? How does this influence how do you think about yourself? And the final this isn't really a theory that explains deviance so much as it is a interactionist kind of concept about how people try to rationalize deviance to themselves. So this isn't so much why are people deviant, but kind of how do people respond to other people when they are being labeled as deviant. And it's called the techniques of neutralization. So there are 5 major techniques of neutralization. The first one is denial of responsibility. This is the basic, it wasn't my fault. This is where you blame circumstances or other people, but basically you just deny the responsibility of having done this deviant thing or the consequences of this deviant thing that you did. Denial of injury You might acknowledge you did something deviant, but you say, you know what, no one was hurt, right? So, if you're selling drugs and it's weed, you might be like, okay, but weed isn't that dangerous. People wanted to get smoked, they wanted to get high. I'm not really hurting anyone. So, the kind of key term here is that I'm not really hurting anyone. Not that you're denying you did something wrong, but that the wrong thing you did didn't really result in any injury. The third technique is denial of victim. This one is used quite frequently in real life when people are talking about sexual assault or rape cases, where you basically victim blame or victim shame. So you deny that that person was really a victim. They really, she really wanted it, or I mean, well, she was drunk and she shouldn't have been there at that party. By denying that the person victim status, once again, it kind of downplays that you did anything wrong, right? So denial of victim is a way to try to neutralize your deviance. Condemnation of the condemners. This is where you flip the script and you turn it back on whoever is trying to sanction you, right? So you might say, hey, grandma, how can you judge me for smoking weed if you are constantly high on your prescription pain meds? We're both high. The only difference is yours are doctor prescribed, but that means you're no better than me. So the condemnation of the condemners, or you say, oh, dad, yes, I cheated on this test, but, you cheat on mom with your secretary. So how can you judge me? The condemnation of the condemners is basically where you point out that for whatever reason, the condemner has no right to sanction you because they themselves engage in some type of deviance. And the final one is you appeal to higher loyalties, because keeping in mind that deviance is established by dominant society. So if you are arguing that the deviant behavior you engaged in isn't considered deviant to you because you have a higher loyalty, whether it is to your religion or to your family or to your subculture, then that could be a technique of neutralization. So Kim Davis, who was the woman in Kentucky that was refusing to give a marriage license to same-sex couples, right? This was how she tried to neutralize, rationalize her deviance. It is, I know that this is now the law of the land, but because of my interpretation of my religion, I don't agree with it, and that's more important to me than following the law. Or for people that have read or seen the movie Les Miserables, the main character that starts off by getting in trouble by stealing bread to feed his starving family. It's that same kind of appeal to higher loyalty. Like, yes, I know stealing is wrong, but watching my children starve to death is wronger, right? That is not how I should behave as a father, where my primary objective is to take care of them, right? So, that's another way of appealing to higher loyalty. So that is two techniques of neutralization. And once again, because it's focused on meaning making and everyday interaction, it is a symbolic interactionist kind of perspective. And so that is it for part two. The third and fourth videos will be on the criminal justice system, and specifically how sociologists who utilize the conflict perspective study and ask questions about the criminal justice system.